Marcus Thompson's rifle barrel wavered as he peered through the scope, his finger frozen on the trigger. The dying German shepherd looked directly at him with eyes that held impossible intelligence, not the glassy stare of a wounded animal, but the knowing gaze of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. This wasn't just any stray dog bleeding out in the Colorado wilderness. She was heavily pregnant, her swollen belly contracting with labor pains, even as life ebbed from multiple untreated wounds. Dr. Sarah Martinez dropped her medical bag, the contents scattering across the forest floor, as she witnessed what should have been a mercy killing transform into something else entirely. The metallic clang of surgical instruments echoed through the pine trees like a death knell. Marcus saw his own dead K9 partner Jake in those amber eyes, the same loyal desperation, the same silent plea for trust he'd failed to answer in Afghanistan 3 years ago. "Don't you dare pull that trigger," his voice cracked. What force had driven this pregnant mother to crawl miles through mountain terrain to find him? And why did her collar bear the name of a man he'd spent 40 years trying to forget? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Marcus Thompson had been a different man. The Purple Heart recipient and decorated Army K9 handler had returned from his 3rd tour in Afghanistan carrying more than just physical scars. The mountain cabin in the Colorado Rockies was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of Kandahar couldn't follow. But ghosts, Marcus learned, traveled light and moved fast. The Veterans Affairs Office in Denver had delivered the crushing blow on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Due to a clerical error, his disability benefits were suspended pending review. 45 years old, with hands that shook when he thought too hard about sand and blood, Marcus watched his savings evaporate faster than morning mist on the mountainside. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd served his country faithfully now couldn't afford to live in it. Jake haunted every corner of the cabin. The German shepherd had died saving Marcus's squad from an IED, taking shrapnel meant for human flesh. In his final moments, Jake had looked at Marcus with those same intelligent amber eyes, as if forgiving him for every command that led to that dusty road in Afghanistan. The Army had offered Marcus another K9 partner. He'd declined. Some bonds, once broken, were too dangerous to rebuild. Dr. Sarah Martinez represented everything Marcus had convinced himself he didn't deserve. At 35, the veterinarian carried her own invisible wounds, a miscarriage 2 years prior that had ended both her pregnancy and her marriage. She'd moved to the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, seeking the same thing Marcus had, distance from painful memories. Her clinic sat at the edge of town, a converted farmhouse where she treated everything from prize cattle to beloved family pets. The town itself buzzed with whispers about Sterling Enterprises, a dog breeding operation that had appeared seemingly overnight on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. David Sterling, a reclusive millionaire in his 70s, had purchased 300 acres of prime mountain real estate and surrounded it with 12-foot fences topped with razor wire. Locals complained about trucks arriving at all hours, the sound of barking that carried on the wind, and the strange men in black SUVs who accompanied every delivery. Eleanor Whitman, 70 years old and sharp as a tack, served as the town's unofficial information network. Since her husband Harold's death 3 years ago, she'd filled the empty hours by keeping track of everyone else's business. From her kitchen window, she had a perfect view of the road leading to Sterling's compound. She'd counted 17 different trucks in the past month alone, each one carrying cargo she couldn't quite identify from her distance. Marcus had avoided town gossip the same way he avoided crowds and loud noises. They triggered memories he wasn't ready to face. His weekly trips to Cedar Falls were limited to essential supplies and the occasional conversation with Sarah when one of the local rancher's dogs needed emergency care beyond her capabilities. He'd caught her watching him sometimes, those dark eyes holding questions he wasn't ready to answer. The October morning had started like any other hunting season day. Marcus shouldered his rifle and headed into the familiar territory of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where elk season promised both solitude and the chance to stock his freezer for winter. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and the promise of snow, while golden aspen leaves danced in the breeze like nature's confetti. 3 hours into his trek, Marcus heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not the sharp crack of a branch or the rustle of wildlife, but a low, keening whimper that spoke of pain beyond measure. The sound triggered something primal in him, a recognition that transcended species. He'd heard that same note of desperation in human voices on foreign battlefields. Following the sound through a grove of towering pines, Marcus discovered her in a small clearing where someone had clearly dumped her like unwanted garbage. The German shepherd lay on her side, ribs showing through matted fur, her swollen belly contracting with labor pains. Blood stained the dry grass beneath her, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold. They tracked his movement with startling intelligence, following him as he approached with the wariness of someone who'd learned that humans could be both savior and destroyer. There was no aggression in her gaze, no fear, just a weary acceptance and something that looked disturbingly like hope. The collar around her neck was expensive leather, though torn and dirty. Marcus could make out partial lettering. Property of Sterling Enter. The rest had been deliberately scratched away, but he didn't need to see more. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew about Sterling Enterprises and their secretive operation. Marcus knelt beside her, his hands automatically moving to check for injuries, while his mind raced. The dog, clearly a purebred German shepherd of exceptional bloodlines, had obviously been beaten and starved. Fresh wounds suggested she'd been dumped recently, probably within the last 24 hours. But whoever had abandoned her had made a crucial miscalculation. She was stronger than they'd anticipated. "Easy, girl," Marcus whispered, using the same tone he'd perfected with Jake during their deployments. To his amazement, the dog's ears perked up at his voice. When he gave the hand signal for "stay," she immediately relaxed, her head settling back onto the pine needles. That's when Marcus realized the terrible truth. This wasn't just any abandoned breeding dog. This was a trained military or police K9, one who recognized standard commands and trusted in the authority of a handler's voice. Someone had taken a highly trained, valuable animal and thrown her away like garbage when she became inconvenient. The decision to move her nearly cost Marcus his back and his sanity. The German shepherd, even emaciated, weighed close to 70 pounds, and every step toward his cabin seemed to take an eternity. She didn't fight him, though. Instead, she seemed to understand that he was trying to help, occasionally lifting her head to look at him with those remarkable amber eyes. By the time they reached his cabin, Marcus was sweating despite the cool mountain air, and the dog was showing signs of imminent labor. He'd delivered puppies before during his K9 training, but never under these circumstances, never with stakes that felt so impossibly high. The first puppy arrived within an hour of reaching the cabin, small and dark, and fighting for every breath. Marcus cleared the birth sac and stimulated breathing the way he'd been taught, feeling his heart pound as the tiny creature gasped and then began to cry with surprisingly strong lungs. The mother, he'd started thinking of her as Bella after the beautiful intelligence in her eyes, managed to lift her head enough to lick her firstborn clean. The tenderness in that simple gesture nearly broke something inside Marcus's chest. 3 more puppies followed over the next 2 hours. Each delivery seemed to drain more life from Bella, but she never stopped fighting. Marcus found himself coaching her through each contraction, offering water and gentle encouragement the way he'd seen Army medics work with wounded soldiers. When the fourth puppy arrived stillborn, Marcus felt Bella's anguish as acutely as his own. She nuzzled the lifeless form with heartbreaking gentleness before looking at Marcus with eyes that seemed to ask for understanding. He took the tiny body away quietly, burying it beneath the old oak tree behind his cabin while Bella tended to her 3 surviving children. As evening settled over the mountains, Marcus sat on his cabin floor watching a dying dog nurse 3 newborn puppies and realized that everything in his carefully controlled, isolated life was about to change. The torn collar with Sterling's name felt like a ticking time bomb sitting on his kitchen table, and the intelligent way Bella responded to his every movement told him this was no ordinary rescue. He'd thought saving her would be the hardest part. As he watched her amber eyes tracking his every move with growing trust, Marcus began to understand he'd been terribly, dangerously wrong. 3 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Marcus had transformed his living room into a makeshift nursery with old blankets arranged near the fireplace where Bella could keep her puppies warm while maintaining visual contact with every entrance to the cabin. She was recovering faster than he'd dared hope, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that sudden movements could mean the difference between life and death. It was on the 4th morning, while Marcus was preparing breakfast, that Bella did something that stopped him cold. He'd been struggling with a particularly stubborn jar of peanut butter, his hands shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep, when he accidentally knocked over his medication bottle. The small orange container hit the floor and scattered pills across the kitchen tiles, his PTSD medication, the one thing that kept the nightmares at bay. Before Marcus could move, Bella was there. Despite her recent surgery and obvious weakness, she'd risen from her bed and begun methodically gathering the scattered pills in her mouth, bringing them to him one by one. But it wasn't just helpful behavior, it was precise, trained, deliberate. She was performing a medical alert response, the kind taught to specialized service dogs who worked with veterans. "How do you know that command?" Marcus whispered, staring down at the intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets he was afraid to uncover. His answer came that afternoon when Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived for her scheduled checkup. Marcus had called her on the 2nd day, unable to properly examine Bella's internal injuries without proper equipment. Sarah had agreed to make a house call, though her expression suggested she had questions about the mysterious appearance of a purebred German shepherd in Marcus's isolated cabin. "She's responding remarkably well," Sarah said, running gentle hands along Bella's flanks while the dog submitted to the examination with military precision. "But Marcus, these aren't accidental injuries. Someone did this to her deliberately." The scars told a story neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Cigarette burns along her hindquarters, healed fractures in her ribs that spoke of systematic beatings, fresh wounds that suggested she'd been dragged behind a vehicle. But most telling were the pressure marks around her neck, evidence of a shock collar used far beyond any reasonable training protocol. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've seen this dog before." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "What do you mean?" "About 6 months ago, a man brought in 3 German shepherds for emergency surgery. They'd been shot, not by hunters, by someone using military-grade ammunition. 2 of them didn't make it." Sarah's hands trembled as she continued her examination. This was one of the survivors. Her name was written on the medical chart as Asset B7, not Bella. She belonged to something called Project Shepherd. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Project Shepherd had been a classified military program, one he'd heard whispered about in the darker corners of K9 operations overseas. Dogs bred and trained not just for detection work but for psychological operations. Animals so intelligent and emotionally intuitive they could serve as living therapy units for soldiers with severe PTSD. "The man who brought them in," Marcus said, his voice barely steady. "What did he look like? Older, maybe 70s, silver hair, expensive clothes. He paid in cash, $15,000, and said the dogs were worth more than most people's houses." Sarah paused in her examination, her face pale. "Marcus, he had the same eyes as you?" Not the color, but the way he looked at those dogs, like he was seeing ghosts. That evening, after Sarah had left with promises to return in a few days, Marcus sat on his porch watching Bella interact with her puppies. The smallest one, a female with markings identical to her mother's, had been struggling to nurse. Bella had gently moved her larger siblings aside, ensuring the weakest got first access to milk. It was a level of cognitive reasoning that went far beyond normal canine behavior. The phone call came at 11:47 p.m., jolting Marcus from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in years. The voice on the other end was elderly but strong, with the crisp diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You have something that belongs to me," the voice said without preamble. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "You know who this is, and you know what I'm calling about." A pause, filled with the weight of decades. "The dog is valuable property, son. More valuable than you can possibly imagine. I'm prepared to offer you compensation for her return. $50,000, cash, no questions asked." The casual mention of money that could solve all of Marcus's financial problems sent alarm bells ringing through his head. No one offered that kind of cash for a breeding dog, no matter how exceptional her bloodlines. "I found her dying in the woods," Marcus said carefully. "Someone had dumped her like garbage." The laugh that came through the phone was bitter and knowing. "Is that what you think happened? Son, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. That dog is worth more than money. She's worth lives." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the silent phone while Bella raised her head from her puppies and fixed him with a look that seemed to say she'd been expecting this call all along. Marcus spent the next morning researching Sterling Enterprises with the methodical intensity he'd once reserved for intelligence gathering in hostile territory. What he found made his blood run cold. On paper, Sterling Enterprises appeared to be a legitimate breeding operation specializing in working dogs for law enforcement and private security. But the deeper Marcus dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Property records showed David Sterling had purchased not just the compound outside Cedar Falls, but similar facilities in 6 other states over the past decade. Each location was isolated, heavily secured, and operated under strict confidentiality agreements with local law enforcement. Public records were suspiciously sparse, with most documents sealed under provisions of the Patriot Act. But it was a blog post from a former employee that made Marcus's hands shake as he read. Jennifer Walsh, a veterinary technician who'd worked at the Nevada facility for 8 months, had published a detailed account of what she'd witnessed before fleeing in the middle of the night. Her story painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as advanced training protocols. According to Walsh, Sterling's operation bred dogs specifically for psychological manipulation research. The animals underwent conditioning that pushed them far beyond normal training limits, using techniques that would have been considered torture if applied to humans. Dogs that showed exceptional intelligence and emotional sensitivity were subjected to increasingly severe stress testing to measure their breaking points. The most disturbing revelation was Project Shepherd itself, a joint venture between Sterling Enterprises and a private military contractor. They were breeding and training dogs not just for detection work, but as living psychological weapons. Dogs so attuned to human trauma and emotion that they could either heal severe PTSD or, with different conditioning, weaponize it against enemy combatants. Marcus closed his laptop and looked at Bella, who was watching him with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes. She'd been bred to be either an angel or a weapon, depending on who controlled her training. Someone had tried to turn her into the latter, and when she'd resisted or failed to meet their standards, they'd attempted to dispose of the evidence. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Whitman appeared at Marcus's door carrying a casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of a woman on a mission. At 70, Eleanor moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent decades managing a household and wouldn't be deterred by a little thing like social boundaries. "Don't you dare tell me you're fine," she said, pushing past Marcus before he could object. "Half the town's talking about the beautiful dog you've got, and the other half's worried about those black SUVs that have been circling your property." Eleanor's sharp eyes took in the makeshift nursery, Bella's healing wounds, and the unmistakable signs of a man living on the edge of exhaustion. But when she knelt beside Bella and the dog immediately offered her paw in greeting, Eleanor's expression softened into something resembling wonder. "Well, aren't you a sweetheart?" she murmured, accepting the offered paw with the gravity of a formal introduction. "And these babies? Lord have mercy, they're beautiful." What happened next convinced Marcus that Bella was indeed something extraordinary. As Eleanor settled onto the floor beside the makeshift whelping box, she began talking about her late husband Harold, her voice taking on the particular cadence of someone processing deep grief. Bella, without any prompting, moved closer and rested her head on Eleanor's lap, a classic therapy dog response to emotional distress. "She knows," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She knows I hurt." Over the next hour, Eleanor shared her story. 3 years of loneliness since Harold's death. Adult children scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives to call regularly. Long days that stretched into longer nights with only television for company. The slow realization that she was becoming invisible in her own community. But as she spoke, something magical happened. Bella seemed to absorb Eleanor's pain, her presence providing the kind of comfort that no human consolation could match. The smallest puppy, the one who'd been struggling to thrive, crawled into Eleanor's hands and fell asleep with complete trust. "She's choosing you," Marcus said quietly, watching the interaction with fascination. "Both of them are." Eleanor looked up with eyes bright with tears and possibility. "What do you mean?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the afternoon quiet. 3 black SUVs pulled into his driveway with military precision, disgorging men in dark suits who moved with the coordinated efficiency of a professional security team. Bella immediately went into alert mode, positioning herself between the puppies and the front door, while Eleanor instinctively moved to shield the smallest puppy with her body. Marcus felt his PTSD symptoms flare as the vehicle's arrival triggered memories of convoy movements in Afghanistan. But Bella's presence somehow kept the flashbacks at bay. The man who emerged from the lead vehicle was exactly as Sarah had described, tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed, with eyes that held decades of secrets. David Sterling moved with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Mr. Thompson," Sterling said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent a lifetime commanding others. "I believe we need to talk." "This is private property," Marcus replied, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "You're not welcome here." Sterling's smile held no warmth. "Son, that dog represents a significant investment in time, money, and research. She's not a pet. She's valuable military equipment that's been stolen from a classified program." "I found her dying in the woods," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Someone had dumped her like garbage." "Someone tried to steal her," Sterling corrected. An employee with a misguided sense of morality decided to liberate several assets from our facility. We've been tracking her for weeks. Eleanor stood up with the dignity of a woman who'd weathered 7 decades of life's storms. That dog is caring for newborn puppies. She's not going anywhere. Sterling's expression hardened as he took in Eleanor's protective stance and Bella's obvious attachment to both humans. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this doesn't concern you. That animal is government property, bred and trained under classified protocols. Her DNA alone is worth more than most people make in a lifetime." "Her DNA," Marcus repeated, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "She's Jake's daughter, isn't she?" The flash of surprise in Sterling's eyes confirmed Marcus's suspicion. Before the older man could control his expression, "I don't know what you're talking about. Jake was my K-9 partner in Afghanistan. German Shepherd, exceptional bloodlines, killed saving my squad 3 years ago." Marcus felt Bella press against his leg, offering comfort as his voice broke slightly. "The Army told me his bloodline ended with him. They lied." Sterling's composure cracked slightly. "That information is classified. You bred her from Jake's genetics," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "That's why she responds to my commands. That's why she can read my PTSD symptoms. You used my dead partner's DNA to create a weapon." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whimpering of puppies and the sound of Eleanor's quiet weeping. Bella moved between Marcus and Sterling, her body language making it clear she'd chosen her side in this confrontation. Sterling looked at his men, then back at Marcus with an expression that seemed to war between business pragmatism and something that might have been regret. "The program is bigger than one dog, son. Bigger than your feelings about your dead partner. We're trying to save lives. By torturing innocent animals. By creating tools that can help soldiers like you process trauma instead of eating a bullet in some godforsaken cabin." Sterling's voice carried genuine passion now. "Do you have any idea how many veterans we've lost to suicide? How many could be saved if we had therapy dogs this effective?" Eleanor stepped forward, still cradling the tiny puppy. "Then why was she starved and beaten? Why was she dumped to die?" Sterling's jaw tightened. "There were complications with her conditioning. Some subjects prove resistant to certain protocols." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, not the wild, uncontrolled anger of his PTSD episodes, but the cold, focused fury of a soldier who'd found his enemy. "She wouldn't break, so you tried to dispose of her. The program requires absolute obedience and emotional detachment." "Personal attachment compromises effectiveness." Sterling's voice grew colder. "That dog formed unauthorized bonds with handlers. She became unreliable. She became human," Eleanor said quietly. "And that scared you?" The confrontation escalated when Dr. Sarah Martinez's pickup truck roared into the driveway, her emergency lights flashing as she took in the scene of armed men surrounding Marcus's cabin. She jumped out with the fierce determination of someone who'd taken an oath to protect innocent lives, her medical bag in one hand and her cell phone in the other. "I've already called Sheriff Rodriguez," she announced, her voice carrying across the tense standoff. "He's en route with backup, and I've documented every injury on that dog. If you try to remove her, you'll be facing charges of animal cruelty and theft." Sterling's composure finally cracked. "Dr. Martinez, you're interfering with a federal operation. That dog is classified military equipment, not a patient." "That dog is a living being who's been systematically tortured," Sarah shot back, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "And these puppies are barely a week old. Moving them could kill them." Marcus watched the interplay with growing fascination. Sterling's men were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, especially as neighbors began appearing on the periphery of the property, drawn by the unusual activity. Word traveled fast in small mountain communities, and the sight of federal agents threatening a local veteran and his rescue dog was exactly the kind of story that could explode across social media within hours. But it was Bella herself who changed the dynamics of the confrontation. As the tension mounted, she suddenly left her protective position between Marcus and Sterling and walked directly to the older man. For a moment, Marcus thought she was going to attack, but instead she sat precisely at Sterling's feet and offered her paw in the same formal greeting she'd given Eleanor. Sterling stared down at the dog in obvious shock. "Asset B7 does not perform social gestures," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was conditioned against pack bonding behaviors." "Her name is Bella," Marcus said firmly, "and she's choosing to trust you despite what you've done to her." What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Sterling, this powerful man who commanded government contracts worth millions of dollars, slowly knelt in the dirt and took Bella's offered paw. For just a moment, his carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing something raw and broken underneath. "I haven't seen my son in 40 years, Sterling said, his voice so quiet that only Marcus and Sarah could hear him. "I've built an empire trying to save soldiers like him, and I don't even know if he's alive or dead." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Sterling looked up with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient. "Marcus Thompson, born October 15, 1978 at Denver General Hospital. Mother, Linda Thompson, deceased 2001. Father, listed as unknown." His voice broke slightly. "I was 19 and scared, and I made the worst decision of my life." The world tilted sideways as Marcus processed the impossible revelation. "You're lying." "I've been tracking your military career for 15 years, Sterling continued, still kneeling beside Bella. "Every deployment, every commendation, every injury report. When Jake died saving your squad, I acquired his genetic material and began the breeding program. I thought if I could create dogs that could help veterans like you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor, who had been listening with the sharp attention of someone who'd raised 4 children and recognized family drama when she saw it, stepped forward with the smallest puppy still cradled in her arms. "That's why you recognized her training. She's not just bred from your partner's line. She's been designed to respond specifically to your psychological profile." Dr. Sarah put the pieces together with the clinical precision of her medical training. The medication response, the PTSD alerts, the way she reads his emotional state. You didn't just breed a therapy dog. You bred a dog specifically designed to heal your son. Sterling's security team shifted uncomfortably as their boss knelt in the dirt beside a dog he'd ordered them to retrieve, tears streaming down his weathered face. The man who'd built a military contracting empire was crying over a beaten animal and the son he'd abandoned 4 decades ago. "I told myself it was about the program," Sterling whispered, "about helping veterans. But every dog I bred, every protocol I developed, I was trying to create something that could bring you home." Marcus felt his world restructuring itself around this impossible truth. His entire life, the abandonment, the military service, even finding Bella, had been orchestrated by a father he'd never known existed. The rage he expected to feel was strangely absent, replaced by a hollow numbness that felt almost worse. "You had no right," Marcus said finally. "No right to manipulate my life. No right to torture innocent animals for your guilt." "No," Sterling agreed, his hand resting gently on Bella's head. "I didn't. But I was dying anyway, and I thought maybe I could do one thing right before the cancer finished me off." The word cancer landed like another bombshell. Sarah immediately shifted into medical mode, her trained eye taking in details she'd missed before. The slight tremor in Sterling's hands, the way he favored his left side, the barely noticeable yellowing of his sclera that suggested liver involvement. "How long?" she asked quietly. 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. Sterling's laugh held no humor. "I've got more money than God and the best doctor's money can buy, but there's no treatment for the kind of stupid that makes a man abandon his family." Eleanor, who had been unusually quiet during this revelation, suddenly spoke up with the authority of someone who'd survived the Great Depression and raised children through multiple wars. "Well, this is a fine mess you've made," she said, addressing Sterling directly. "But sitting in the dirt feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to fix 40 years of mistakes." The unexpected rebuke from the elderly woman seemed to snap Sterling back to some semblance of composure. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a private family matter." "Horse hockey," Eleanor shot back, using an expression that would have made her grandmother proud. "That dog chose this family, those puppies need their mother, and your son has been healing for the first time in years. You think you can just waltz in here with your government badges and tear apart something beautiful because you feel guilty?" Marcus found himself staring at this 70-year-old widow who was lecturing a millionaire defense contractor like he was a misbehaving schoolboy. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Spent every day since then feeling sorry for myself and waiting to die. Then I met this dog and these babies, and I remembered what it felt like to be needed. You want to make amends? Then figure out how to do it without destroying the good that's already happened." Bella, as if understanding the emotional crossroads they'd reached, stood and walked back to Marcus. But this time she didn't position herself protectively between him and Sterling. Instead, she sat equidistant between father and son, her intelligent amber eyes moving from one to the other, as if willing them to bridge the 40-year chasm that separated them. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tension as Sheriff Rodriguez arrived with 2 deputies, their vehicles kicking up dust clouds as they pulled into the already crowded driveway. Marcus knew Rodriguez, a good man who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home to work in law enforcement. The sheriff took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. "Dr. Martinez called about a potential animal cruelty situation," Rodriguez said, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Everyone want to tell me what's going on here?" Sterling's men immediately began producing federal credentials and making phone calls, but Rodriguez held up a hand for silence. In rural Colorado, federal jurisdiction was a complex matter, and local law enforcement wasn't easily intimidated by men in expensive suits. "That's a beautiful dog," Rodriguez said, addressing Marcus directly. "Looks like she's been through some rough times." "Someone dumped her to die," Marcus replied. "She was pregnant and beaten half to death. And now these gentlemen want to take her away from her puppies?" Rodriguez's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "That doesn't sound very neighborly." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. The smallest puppy, still cradled in Eleanor's arms, began crying with the distinctive distress call of a newborn in trouble. Bella immediately went into alert mode, but Eleanor was already moving toward the cabin. "She needs to nurse," Eleanor announced. "This baby hasn't eaten in over an hour." Without waiting for permission from anyone, she headed inside, followed immediately by Bella and then by Dr. Sarah. Marcus found himself looking at his newly discovered father and making the most important decision of his adult life. "Come on," he said to Sterling. "You want to see what your program actually created? Come meet your granddogs." The tragedy began 3 weeks later, just as Marcus had started to believe that maybe, somehow, his shattered family could find a way to heal together. Sterling had been visiting daily, initially under the pretense of evaluating the assets, but increasingly just to sit on the cabin floor and watch his granddogs grow. The change in the older man was remarkable, the corporate coldness melting away to reveal someone who laughed at puppy antics and spoke in gentle tones to both Bella and her babies. Eleanor had appointed herself the unofficial grandmother of the pack, arriving each morning with homemade treats for the dogs and increasingly elaborate meals for the humans. She'd moved into the cabin's spare room temporarily to help with the round-the-clock puppy care, but everyone understood it had become permanent. For the first time in years, Marcus's home felt alive with purpose and love. Dr. Sarah had become a daily fixture as well, ostensibly to monitor Bella's recovery, but really because she'd found herself drawn into this unconventional family unit. The attraction between her and Marcus was obvious to everyone except them, and Eleanor had taken to making pointed comments about young people these days being too stubborn to recognize love when it bit them on the nose. The first sign of trouble came when Sheriff Rodriguez called with news that made Marcus's blood run cold. "We found Jennifer Walsh," he said, his voice grim, "the veterinarian who wrote that blog post about Sterling's facilities. She's in Denver General, critical condition." Walsh had been found beaten nearly to death in a parking garage, her laptop stolen and her apartment ransacked. The message was clear. Talking about Project Shepherd came with deadly consequences. When Marcus relayed this information to his father, Sterling's face went ashen. "I shut down the security protocols when I came here," Sterling admitted, his hands shaking as he held the smallest puppy. I thought I was in control of my own operation." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her medical training making her sensitive to the signs of panic she was seeing in Sterling's behavior. "The program has military oversight," Sterling explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Joint Chiefs, Pentagon black budget, connections I can't control anymore. When I redirected resources to find Marcus, when I started questioning the conditioning protocols, I may have triggered responses I didn't anticipate." That evening, as Marcus was securing the cabin for the night, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but the message was crystal clear. "You have 24 hours to return the assets to Sterling Enterprises," the voice said. "The breeding female and all offspring are to be surrendered immediately. Failure to comply will result in permanent resolution of the situation." Marcus felt the old, familiar ice of combat fear flooding his system, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about his own survival. Bella, her puppies, Eleanor, Sarah, even Sterling himself were all at risk because of his decision to keep his found family together. When he shared the threat with the others, the response was immediate and unified. Eleanor, despite her age, announced she was too damn old to be intimidated by cowards who threatened babies. Sarah began making calls to veterinary colleagues, building a network of safe houses for the dogs if they needed to run. Even Sterling, despite his obvious terror about his former associates, stood firm. "I created this mess," Sterling said, his voice carrying a strength Marcus had never heard before. "I won't let them hurt my family because of my mistakes." The attack came at dawn, executed with military precision that spoke of professional operators rather than simple thugs. Marcus woke to the sound of Bella's low warning growl, followed immediately by the crash of breaking glass as smoke grenades came through the windows. The cabin filled with choking gray fog that sent everyone into immediate panic mode. Through the chaos, Marcus could hear Eleanor coughing and crying, "The puppies! Where are the puppies?" Bella was barking with a ferocity he'd never heard from her, the sound of a mother protecting her young against impossible odds. Sarah was shouting medical instructions, trying to treat smoke inhalation while barely able to see her own hands. But it was Sterling's scream that cut through everything else, a sound of pure anguish that spoke of wounds far deeper than anything physical. "No, not her. Take me instead." When the smoke finally cleared, the devastating reality became apparent. The attackers had been surgical in their cruelty. They'd taken only one puppy, the smallest one, the female that Eleanor had been so carefully nurturing back to health. The other two puppies remained, unharmed but crying frantically for their missing sister. Bella was inconsolable, searching every corner of the cabin with the desperate intensity of a mother who knows one of her children is missing. Her cries were heartbreaking, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of maternal anguish. She would position herself by the door and howl, then run to the window, then back to where the puppy's bed had been, as if she could somehow track her missing baby through sheer force of will. Eleanor was in shock, her face gray with trauma as she held the two remaining puppies against her chest. She was so small, she kept repeating. She was just starting to gain weight. She needed her mother. The note left on Marcus's kitchen table was brief and to the point. The female pup is being held as insurance. Any attempt to involve law enforcement will result in her immediate termination. Sterling Enterprises has 24 hours to resume normal operations. The breeding female and remaining offspring will be collected at 1800 hours tomorrow. Dr. Sarah found Sterling collapsed in the corner of the cabin, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. His face had taken on the waxy pallor of someone in cardiac distress, and when she checked his pulse, it was rapid and irregular. "I think he's having a heart attack," she said, already reaching for her emergency medical kit. "We need to get him to a hospital immediately." But Sterling grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "No hospitals," he gasped. "They'll find us there." "They'll finish what they started." Marcus knelt beside his father, seeing for the first time not the powerful defense contractor who'd manipulated his life, but a broken old man who'd finally found something worth living for and was watching it slip away. "We'll get her back," Marcus promised, though he had no idea how. "You don't understand," Sterling wheezed, his breathing becoming more labored. "The people I worked with, they don't see these dogs as living beings. They're assets, investments, research subjects. That puppy isn't being held for ransom. She's being prepared for conditioning." The full horror of the situation hit them all at once. The tiny puppy that Eleanor had been bottle-feeding, the one who fell asleep in human hands and trusted completely in their protection, was now in the hands of people who would systematically break her spirit in the name of creating a more effective weapon. Bella seemed to understand the threat to her baby with an intelligence that transcended species barriers. She positioned herself at the cabin door and refused to move, her amber eyes fixed on the driveway as if she could will her missing puppy to return through sheer maternal determination. "There's something else," Sterling continued, his voice growing weaker. "The conditioning protocol for females is different, harsher. They break their maternal instincts first, then rebuild them around absolute obedience to handlers." His eyes filled with tears. "If we don't get her back within 48 hours, she'll never be the same. They'll turn her into something that can't love, can't trust, can't bond." Eleanor began crying then, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh sobs of someone whose heart was breaking in real time. She'd opened herself to love again after 3 years of grief-numbed existence, only to have it ripped away by faceless monsters who saw innocence as raw material for their weapons programs. Marcus felt his PTSD symptoms flaring. The hypervigilance, the rage, the desperate need to fight something, anything to protect his pack. But for the first time since Jake's death, he also felt something else. Purpose. Not the hollow determination of someone with nothing left to lose, but the fierce clarity of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for. As night fell over the mountains, the cabin felt like a fortress under siege. Sheriff Rodriguez had positioned deputies on the access roads, but everyone knew that if the people behind Project Shepherd wanted to escalate, local law enforcement would be powerless to stop them. The real tragedy wasn't just the kidnapping of one small puppy. It was the shattering of hope that had taken weeks to carefully build. Marcus watched Sterling struggling to breathe while Eleanor grieved for a baby that wasn't even her own, while Bella paced and whined and searched for a child that might already be lost forever. They had 18 hours to find a solution, and Marcus was beginning to understand that sometimes love isn't enough to protect the innocent from those who see compassion as weakness to be exploited. The revelation came at 3 in the morning, when Sterling's labored breathing finally stabilized enough for him to speak coherently. Dr. Sarah had managed his cardiac episode with a combination of emergency medications and sheer determination, but it was clear he was running on borrowed time. Eleanor sat beside his makeshift bed, holding his hand with the fierce tenderness of someone who'd nursed her own husband through his final illness. "There's something I never told you about Project Shepherd," Sterling whispered, his eyes fixed on Marcus with desperate intensity. "Something that changes everything." Marcus leaned forward, exhaustion making his movements sluggish, but his attention laser-focused. Bella pressed against his side, her amber eyes never leaving the door where her missing puppy had last been seen. "The people who took her, they're not working for the government anymore," Sterling continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "6 months ago, when I started questioning the conditioning protocols, I discovered they'd been selling dogs to private military contractors, taking animals bred for healing and turning them into weapons for the highest bidder." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You mean—" "I mean Colonel Harrison and his team went rogue," Sterling said, his face twisted with anguish. "They've been using Project Shepherd assets for illegal operations, drug interdiction in South America, crowd control for dictatorships, psychological warfare in conflicts that don't officially exist. That puppy isn't just being conditioned, she's being prepared for sale to people who will use her to terrorize innocent civilians." Sarah felt her medical oath burning in her chest like a physical pain. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for months, but I only confirmed it 2 weeks ago when I tried to shut down the Nevada facility." Sterling's breathing became more labored as his agitation increased. "Harrison threatened to expose my search for Marcus if I interfered with their operations. I thought I could handle them, control the situation." His laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. "I was a fool." Eleanor's voice cut through the darkness with the practical wisdom of someone who'd survived 7 decades of human folly. "Well, standing around feeling sorry for ourselves isn't going to save that baby. What do we know about where they've taken her?" Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not the wild rage of his PTSD episodes, but the cold, calculating focus that had made him an effective soldier. "Tell me about Harrison. Everything you know." Over the next hour, Sterling painted a picture of Colonel James Harrison that made Marcus's blood run cold. A career military officer who'd been quietly forced into retirement after allegations of excessive force in overseas operations, Harrison had been recruited by Sterling 3 years ago to oversee the conditioning protocols for Project Shepherd. What Sterling had seen as necessary discipline, Harrison had twisted into systematic abuse. "He has a compound in Wyoming," Sterling revealed, pulling a crumpled business card from his wallet. "Officially, it's a private security training facility. Unofficially, it's where they break animals and rebuild them into weapons." Sarah studied the address with growing horror. "That's 12 hours from here by car. If they're already starting the conditioning process—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that time was running out for the smallest member of their found family. But it was Eleanor who provided the crucial insight that changed everything. "You're all thinking like this is some kind of military operation," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd raised 4 children and managed a household through multiple economic crises. But Harrison made one crucial mistake. He took a baby from her mother. Marcus looked at Bella, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the night wore on. The German shepherd was exhibiting behaviors he'd never seen before, pacing in specific patterns, pausing at windows to test the air, positioning herself near the door with the alert intensity of a soldier preparing for battle. "She knows where her puppy is," Eleanor continued. "Not specifically, but she can sense direction, maybe even distance. Animals have navigation abilities we don't fully understand." Dr. Sarah's medical training kicked in as she considered the biological possibilities. Pheromone tracking, magnetic field sensitivity, maybe even some kind of psychological bond we can't measure. If the puppy is under severe stress, the mother might be able to sense it across considerable distances. Sterling struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. "There's something else. Harrison doesn't know about Marcus being my son. As far as he knows, you're just some local veteran who stumbled onto a valuable asset. He'll be expecting a rescue attempt, but not from someone with your training and motivation." Marcus felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in his mind. "What kind of security does the Wyoming facility have?" "Military grade, but designed to keep people out, not to contain someone who's already inside," Sterling replied. "Harrison's arrogant. He thinks superior firepower makes him untouchable. He won't be expecting a covert insertion." The next revelation came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived at dawn with information that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. "I've been making some calls," he announced, his face grim with determination. "Turns out Colonel Harrison has been on the FBI's radar for months. They've been building a case for international trafficking, but they needed evidence." Marcus felt hope flickering for the first time since the attack. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that a recording device planted on a rescue dog might provide," Rodriguez continued. "If someone were to infiltrate the facility and document what's happening there, it could bring down the entire operation." Dr. Sarah immediately grasped the implications. "You're talking about using Bella as an undercover agent, sending her in to find her puppy while wearing a wire." The idea was audacious and dangerous, but as they discussed the logistics, it began to seem like their only viable option. Bella's maternal instincts would drive her to locate her missing baby, while her training would allow her to navigate a hostile environment without raising immediate suspicion. But Eleanor raised the ethical question that made them all pause. Are we really talking about risking another innocent life to save the one that's already been taken? Marcus knelt beside Bella, looking into those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations. "It has to be her choice," he said quietly. "We can't force her to go." What happened next convinced everyone that Bella understood far more than any of them had imagined. Marcus laid out photos of the Wyoming facility that Sterling had provided, speaking to her in the same tone he'd used with Jake during mission briefings. When he showed her the location and explained that her puppy was there, Bella's response was immediate and unambiguous. She walked to the door, looked back at Marcus, and barked once, the crisp, authoritative sound of a working dog accepting a mission. Sterling struggled to his feet, his face showing the toll of his cardiac episode, but his eyes bright with desperate determination. "I'm going with you." "Dad, you can barely stand," Marcus protested, the word "dad" slipping out before he could stop it. "That facility exists because of my decisions," Sterling replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of regret. "I created the monster that took our granddaughter. I'll be damned if I don't help destroy it." Eleanor surprised everyone by announcing her intention to join the rescue mission. "That baby knows my voice, my scent. If she's been traumatized, she might not respond to anyone else." Dr. Sarah completed their unlikely rescue team. "If we're retrieving an animal that's been subjected to psychological conditioning, you'll need someone with veterinary training to assess her condition and provide immediate care." As they prepared to leave for Wyoming, Marcus realized they weren't just planning a rescue mission, They were preparing to take down an entire network of people who treated innocent animals as disposable weapons. The stakes had grown far beyond saving one small puppy. They were fighting for the principle that some forms of cruelty were unacceptable, regardless of their supposed justification. Sheriff Rodriguez handed Marcus a small recording device designed to be attached to Bella's collar. Everything she sees and hears will be transmitted to FBI agents positioned outside the facility. When you go in, you won't be going alone. Marcus attached the device to Bella's collar, then knelt to look her in the eyes one more time. "Ready to bring your baby home, girl?" Bella's response was to place her paw on his hand, the same gesture of trust and partnership that had started this entire journey. They were no longer just a man and a dog. They were partners in a mission that would either reunite their family or destroy them all in the attempt. The Wyoming facility sat like a scar against the pristine mountain landscape, surrounded by razor wire and motion sensors that gleamed in the early morning sun. Marcus crouched in the tree line with Bella at his side, both of them studying the compound through binoculars, while FBI agents positioned themselves at strategic points around the perimeter. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Bella would enter the facility through a drainage culvert that Sterling's architectural plans had revealed, locate her puppy using her maternal instincts, and document everything she encountered through the camera hidden in her collar. Marcus would follow at a safe distance, ready to extract both dogs when the FBI moved in to shut down the operation. What they hadn't anticipated was the sound that greeted them as they approached the facility, the unmistakable chorus of dozens of dogs in various states of distress. Bella's ears perked forward with acute attention, her nostrils flaring as she processed scents that told a story of systematic abuse and broken spirits. "Jesus," whispered Agent Thompson, the FBI team leader who'd been tracking Harrison's operation for months. "How many animals are they holding in there?" Sterling, despite his weakened condition, had insisted on being present for the operation. His face went ashen as the reality of what his program had become hit him with full force. "I thought it was just a few dozen high-value assets," he said, his voice barely audible. "This sounds like a factory," Dr. Sarah finished grimly, her veterinary training allowing her to interpret the different types of vocalizations they were hearing. "Those aren't just training sounds. Some of those animals are in severe psychological distress." Eleanor, who had positioned herself as the communications coordinator despite her age, spoke into her radio with the crisp authority of a woman who'd managed church committees and volunteer organizations for decades. "All units, be advised, we're dealing with a much larger operation than anticipated. Prepare for multiple animal evacuations." The first part of the mission went flawlessly. Bella navigated the drainage system with the precision of a trained operative, her collar camera providing crystal-clear footage of corridors lined with kennels containing dozens of German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and other working breeds. The conditions were horrific. Animals cowering in corners, showing signs of electrical shock training, and displaying the broken postures of creatures whose spirits had been systematically destroyed. But it was when Bella reached the conditioning wing that everyone watching the live feed felt their hearts break. The smallest puppy, their granddaughter, as Eleanor had taken to calling her, was in a specialized isolation chamber, barely large enough for her tiny body. She was hooked to monitoring equipment that measured stress responses while subjecting her to rotating cycles of loud noises, flashing lights, and what appeared to be mild electrical stimulation. "They're trying to break her ability to form emotional attachments," Dr. Sarah explained, her voice thick with professional outrage. "It's a conditioning protocol designed to create animals that can inflict psychological trauma without being affected by their victims' distress." Eleanor's response was immediate and decisive. I've seen enough. We're going in now. Agent Thompson tried to object, citing the need for proper coordination and backup protocols, but Eleanor was already moving toward the facility with the determined stride of a woman who'd made up her mind. That baby has been tortured for 18 hours, she announced over the radio. I don't care about your procedures. No child suffers another minute while we debate tactics. What followed was perhaps the most unconventional rescue operation in FBI history. Eleanor Whitman, 70 years old and armed with nothing but moral authority and a thermos of warm milk, walked directly to the facility's main entrance and began pounding on the door with her cane. "Open up!" she shouted with the lung power of a woman who'd called children in from farm fields for 7 decades. "I know you've got my grandbaby in there, and I'm not leaving without her." The audacity of the approach caught Harrison's security team completely off guard. Through the surveillance feed, Marcus watched armed guards staring in bewilderment at this elderly woman who was treating their high-security compound like a neighbor's house where children were playing too late. "Ma'am, this is a restricted facility," one of the guards announced through the intercom system. "You need to leave immediately." Eleanor's response would have made her late husband proud. "Young man, I've birthed 4 babies, buried 2 husbands, and survived the Iowa corn crisis of '85. You think I'm scared of some tin horn operation that tortures puppies?" While Eleanor's dramatic distraction held everyone's attention at the front gate, Bella had located her daughter and was demonstrating problem-solving abilities that exceeded even Sterling's most optimistic projections. Using her teeth, she began systematically dismantling the monitoring equipment attached to the puppy, her movements precise and purposeful as she freed her baby from the conditioning apparatus. The reunion between mother and daughter was captured in heartbreaking detail by the collar camera. The tiny puppy, despite 18 hours of systematic abuse, immediately recognized her mother's scent and began crying with relief. Bella gently lifted her baby and began the dangerous journey back through the facility's corridors. But it was then that Colonel Harrison himself appeared on the surveillance feed, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The man was everything Sterling had described and worse. Tall, silver-haired, and radiating the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent decades treating living beings as disposable assets. "Bring me the old woman," Harrison ordered his guards. "If someone's found our operation, I want to know who sent them." The tactical situation changed instantly. Eleanor was no longer just creating a distraction. She was in mortal danger from a man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to use violence against the innocent. Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Abandoning the careful extraction plan, he emerged from the tree line and began running toward the facility with the desperate speed of a father protecting his family. "All units, we are going in now," Agent Thompson announced, recognizing that the operation had reached the point of no return. "Subject is threatening a civilian." What followed was controlled chaos as FBI agents breached the facility from multiple points, while Marcus navigated the interior corridors using Bella's camera feed as his guide. The sounds of flashbang grenades and shouted commands echoed through the building as federal agents systematically took control of Harrison's operation. Marcus found Bella in a utility corridor, the tiny puppy clutched gently in her mouth as she made her way toward the exit. The reunion was wordless but profound. Soldier and dog, father and daughter, family members who'd risked everything to bring their baby home. Outside, Eleanor was holding her own against Harrison's interrogation with the steely determination of a woman who'd faced down everything from government bureaucrats to tornado seasons. When Marcus emerged with both dogs, she burst into tears of relief and immediately reached for the smallest member of their pack. "There's my grandbaby," she whispered, cradling the tiny puppy against her chest, while Bella pressed close to ensure her daughter's safety. "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." The sight of their rescued family member, traumatized but alive, should have been the happy ending they'd all prayed for. But as FBI agents led Colonel Harrison away in handcuffs and began documenting the evidence of systematic animal abuse, Marcus realized this was only the beginning of their journey toward healing. The little puppy who'd been subjected to conditioning designed to break her spirit would need months of careful rehabilitation. The dozens of other animals rescued from the facility faced uncertain futures, and Sterling, despite his role in bringing down Harrison's operation, was still a dying man seeking redemption for decades of mistakes. The morning sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and amber as Marcus sat on his cabin porch, watching 3 puppies tumble across the grass under Bella's watchful eye. 6 months had passed since the rescue operation that brought down Project Shepherd, and the healing had been as complex and beautiful as the damage had been deep and systematic. Eleanor had moved permanently into the cabin's expanded guest quarters, transforming what had once been Marcus's isolated refuge into something resembling a real home. Her presence filled the spaces with the sounds of daily life, humming while she cooked, gentle scolding when the puppies tracked mud across clean floors, and the comfortable rhythm of someone who'd found her purpose again after years of loneliness. The smallest puppy, whom they'd named Hope at Eleanor's insistence, had required months of patient rehabilitation. Dr. Sarah had developed a specialized therapy protocol that slowly rebuilt the little dog's ability to trust and bond, using techniques that combined veterinary science with the kind of grandmother's wisdom that Eleanor provided in abundance. The progress had been measured in tiny victories. The first time Hope wagged her tail, the first time she played with her siblings, the first time she fell asleep in human arms without flinching. Sterling had lived to see his granddaughter's recovery, spending his final weeks on the cabin's sun-drenched porch, telling stories about Marcus's childhood that he'd missed, and building elaborate obstacle courses for the puppies to explore. His death had been peaceful, surrounded by the family he'd spent 40 years trying to find. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of veterans whose lives had been touched by the legitimate therapy dog programs that emerged from Project Shepherd's ashes. The Sterling Foundation, established with the fortune Sterling left behind, had become the nation's leading organization for military canine therapy programs. Marcus served as its director, traveling to VA hospitals across the country with teams of specially trained dogs who could recognize and respond to PTSD symptoms with an intuitive understanding that human therapists often struggled to match. Dr. Sarah had become more than just the Foundation's chief veterinary officer. She'd become Marcus's partner in every sense of the word. Their wedding the previous spring had been a small affair, held in the meadow behind the cabin with Bella serving as ring bearer and the 3 puppies creating delightful chaos during the ceremony. Eleanor had cried through the entire service, alternately declaring it the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen and scolding the photographer for not capturing every precious moment. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred in the dozens of dogs rescued from Harrison's facility. Working with animal behaviorists and veterinary specialists, the Sterling Foundation had developed rehabilitation protocols that helped traumatized animals rediscover their capacity for joy and trust. Many of these dogs eventually became therapy animals themselves, their own experiences with trauma making them uniquely qualified to comfort others who suffered. Bella had emerged as the Foundation's most remarkable success story and its unofficial mascot. Her intelligence and emotional sensitivity had made her a legend in veteran therapy circles, but it was her role as a mother and teacher that truly set her apart. She seemed to understand that her own puppies would grow up to serve others, and she prepared them for that responsibility with a dedication that bordered on the mystical. The morning routine had become as precious as it was predictable. Eleanor would emerge from the kitchen carrying a cup of coffee and whatever baked goods had struck her fancy the previous evening. Dr. Sarah would arrive from her clinic with medical updates on their various four-legged patients and usually stayed for breakfast that stretched well into late morning. Marcus would conduct the daily training sessions that kept both human and canine members of their team sharp and ready for whatever challenges the day might bring. Today felt different, though. Marcus could sense anticipation in the air, the kind of electric awareness that preceded significant events. Bella had been more alert than usual, her amber eyes frequently scanning the horizon as if she expected someone important to arrive. The answer came at mid-morning when a government sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a small convoy of vehicles that included several news crews. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with the old familiar tension of unwanted attention, but Eleanor appeared at his elbow with the calm assurance of someone who'd weathered decades of unexpected visitors. "About time they got here," she said, straightening her apron and checking her appearance in the reflection of the kitchen window. "I've been baking since 5 a.m. The delegation was led by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a woman whose reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense had made her a favorite among veterans advocacy groups. She approached Marcus with the respectful directness of someone who understood the value of military service and the cost of survival. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending her hand with genuine warmth, "I'm here to present you and the Sterling Foundation with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for your work with military animal therapy programs." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was the nation's highest civilian honor, reserved for individuals whose contributions had fundamentally changed American society for the better. He'd never imagined that his work with traumatized dogs could be considered worthy of such recognition. Eleanor, however, seemed entirely unsurprised by the announcement. "About time," she repeated, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose faith in justice had been vindicated. "Marcus has been healing broken soldiers for years. Nice to see Washington finally noticed." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his military career. Instead of the formal pomp of government events, it felt more like a family gathering that happened to include cameras and dignitaries. Bella and her puppies were officially recognized as co-recipients of the honor, making them the first therapy animals to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But it was the personal message from the president that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. The letter spoke of sacrifice and service, of the courage required to transform personal trauma into healing for others, and of the profound impact that love and dedication could have on a nation's most vulnerable citizens. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the government officials departed, Marcus found himself alone on the porch with his found family. Eleanor was already planning how to display the medal, right there above the fireplace where everyone can see it. While Dr. Sarah was fielding calls from veterinary schools requesting consultations on animal therapy programs. The puppies, blissfully unaware of their historic achievement, were engaged in a wrestling match that had attracted Bella's amused attention. Marcus watched his pack, for that's what they'd become, a multi-species family bound by love rather than blood, and felt something he'd never expected to experience again: complete contentment. The trauma of his military service would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. The father who'd abandoned him had returned just in time to help create something beautiful from the wreckage of their shared past. The woman he'd fallen in love with shared his commitment to healing others, and the elderly widow who'd become their family's anchor had shown them all what it meant to choose love over fear, even when the world seemed determined to break their hearts. As evening settled over the mountains, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. It had started with a single act of compassion, the decision to save a dying dog rather than end her suffering. That choice had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined, creating a network of healing that now touched thousands of lives across the country. The Sterling Foundation's work would continue long after Marcus was gone, but its true legacy wasn't measured in the number of dogs trained or veterans helped. Its legacy was the proof that families could be built rather than born, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism came not from soldiers on battlefields, but from ordinary people who chose to open their hearts to those who needed them most. Sometimes we lose family, and sometimes we find it in the most unexpected places. Marcus, Eleanor, and Bella's story reminds us that love doesn't diminish when shared. It multiplies. Whether you're 55 or 85, it's never too late to open your heart to new connections, whether with a neighbor who needs friendship, a rescue animal who needs love, or even family members you thought were lost forever. The beautiful truth is that healing can happen at any age, and the families we choose often become the most precious gifts of our later years. What unexpected friendship or family connection has brought the most joy to your later years? Have you ever experienced the healing power of caring for an animal or someone in need? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.